All right. Hey, Wargamers. Today I'm here with Mike from the Chronicles 40K narrative event. It's an upcoming narrative event here in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. And longtime viewers of the channel will know that I tend to focus much more on the competitive or more meta-minded aspects of the game, but that's only a small portion of the larger community. And so today I wanted to kind of talk to Mike about how the narrative portion of things fits into the overall community, and some similarities and differences that you might see between narrative and other types of events. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Mike, thanks for being here with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Mike.
Yeah. So fair warning to everyone, this is the furthest we've got in this stream. This is the second time we're trying it. So there might be some minor hiccups. Bear with us, but we're gonna stick with this stream. So okay. So Mike, can you tell me or tell us a little bit more about what Chronicles is, the overall vision and history and kind of development of the event?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Chronicles itself is a 2-day friendly narrative event in September. It's the 29th to the 30th here in Minnesota, the Twin Cities at Fantasy Flight Games. And it was kind of born out of a combination of two events. So folks who might be aware of the Wapaka tournament every January, which is for a number of years a fantasy event. When fantasy died, it became kind of like more of a convention, whole bunch of different kind of games. And 40K became one of the staple games of that event. And it really started with Ryan Nichols' 40K narrative event, which was this magical one-day event where it was team aspect. It was really getting in kind of the background and the narrative of your warband working with your team, or your army working with your team, as if your army would act, as your commander might act. Really, really cool event that went over really well, was well loved by folks. Second year, I started the 40K friendly at Wapaka, mostly actually so that Ryan Nichols could have an opportunity to play in a 40K event. And so the two of us then for the next 2 years kind of worked 40K events, one for each of us. And then the announcement was made this year that Wapaka was going back to a single event, which was going to be Age of Sigmar, which kind of left the 40K players who had grown to love kind of the narrative-friendly atmosphere of the Wapaka events, kind of hung out to dry. And so Nickel and I got together along with two other folks, Tim Flanders and Eric Hagen, who are both some of the best hobbyists and some of the best, most engaged in narrative play and within the 40K universe there is in the Twin Cities. And we all kind of started collabing to create this combined narrative-friendly event for the Twin Cities. And for us, our vision is ultimately about creating a really cool space where we really want to bring that narrative aspect to an event, where it's not just that you're necessarily out to win for yourself, or win in a vacuum of games, right, where you have 5 maybe separate games and they're not building towards anything. There's nothing connecting them necessarily. We're out to create an event where every game has an impact and every game connects. Like, we've even talked about we're workshopping different ideas right now, and we've come up with some really cool ideas, and I'll leak a little bit one here for you guys, where different tables even have connections within themselves. And so there might be a table that, like, by itself kind of functions. There is one objective that's there, and every game that's played on it, it will mostly just affect itself. It'll build, or it'll waste away depending upon what's going on at the table previously. There's also tables that are connected, and so there might be a one table that has, like, the main objective, and then 3 of them that feed into that. And so what that allows is, it allows for you to maybe go to other folks who are maybe part of your faction, or who may be part of your side, whether restoration or destruction, and be able to say, all right, like, let's it go after this set of tables and their objective, and let's work together towards our side, towards our end goal, what we're trying to achieve. to kind of really bring along both the story aspects of the game, because the 40K universe is really great, like awesome, cool, vast story, but also even a little bit of the team dynamics, because you know, working with other people and trying to achieve something is it's more of a fun feel. We feel like we've had a lot of fun with that at Wapaka, and we really wanted to bring that here. Within this event, though, it's not just the narrative side, and I think that's where you know, we call it a narrative event, I think, more generally, but within most of our taglines, within most of the other stuff we're doing, is also included this idea of the friendly. So it's the combination of the two, and so wanting to, while we're telling a story, also try to create an environment where not only are you going to see lists and armies that are a little bit different than what you might be used to at maybe a more competitive event, because you're hoping for maybe units that are less efficient, less effective, but really cool, or things that you don't get to see or utilize or even play against very often. What is it like to even play against, you know, a bunch of lictors or a bunch of this other thing, right? That like maybe don't see a lot of play in general events. And I think it's a little bit from the side of wanting to make sure that the event is as fun as possible for as many people as possible. And you know, each person has fun in their own way in playing games, and want to recognize that most tournaments out there are generally more for folks who want to be competitive. That's at least what we see around here, at least that I'm aware of. Mostly more on the side of competitive events. And which is great, and I think is a really, really good space for a lot of folks. At the same time, we wanted to create a space that might function a little bit better for folks who maybe don't play as often, or again, who maybe shade towards those units that aren't very effective, or you know, just aren't necessarily that tight in how they want to play the game, and just make sure that they have at least a chance, at least a fighting chance in these battles. You know, to make it something interesting, because like one of the worst things that, I don't know, for me at least, one of the worst kind of games that I can have is when either I am like destroying an opponent or I'm getting destroyed, where like there's no chance. I might as well not have set up this game. I'm like, oh well, you can just kill me in 2 turns. Awesome. And I can try to create a narrative out of that. I can try to create a story, but other than mad dashing towards your line and getting gunned down mercilessly, or getting, you know, absolutely destroyed in combat, it's not necessarily much of a cool narrative there. There's not a back and forth. And so wanting to try to allow for players who may not be as competitive to still engage with the game throughout in a story context. And so I think those two things together really make up a huge part of our vision.
Yeah, so there's a couple things there. One, I don't think you mentioned this, because it's a 2-day event, you talked about how there's interconnectivity between tables and between rounds within a table, and that sounds awesome. I'm excited to hear more about that as we get closer to the date, because again, I'll be in the event for people that are viewing this, so that's part of my personal interest in this. But also, there's a component of this that happens between day 1 and day 2. And that is that you go from a 1,500 point list to a 1,250 point list. And so far in brainstorming ideas, that's actually fairly difficult, because of the caveat that everything that's in your 1,250 list has to also be in your 1,500 list.
Yep.
You can't have, you know, it's fairly easy to come up with some 1,500 point list and some 1,250 list that are not, you know, nested within each other. But once you have them nested, then suddenly you're trying to work within, you know, basically 2 sets of constraints, and that can be trippy. And it takes, every time you make a change to one list, you have to go back the other list.
Yeah.
And so far, that's been kind of like a fun little puzzle for me to deal with. It's, you know, certainly challenging, but fun, just because like it's something that I've never had to do before, which is, I guess, kind of the point that you're getting at.
Yeah, and you know, that we wanted to keep in with the narrative aspect of that, to say, you know, if you had 2 forces that you were the commander for, and it's between this great conflict, right? And all of a sudden you have 2 completely different armies. You know, that might not make as much sense, or, you know, wanting to really think about, like, this one unit has stuck with me this whole event and they haven't died. Like, that's so cool. Or like even being able to provide bonuses for that. Like, this one unit has not died. Maybe there's a mechanic where later on in the event, they get some sort of bonus because they're the veterans, right? And we also, like, I'll talk about it from a logistical standpoint. Day one is a 1,500, it's 1,500 point games, and there's 3 of them. It's just you by yourself. You are playing interconnectedly among, your side and the different tables, but you're playing a one-on-one game. Day 2, we switch to team games. And so there'll be 2 games where you actually team up with another person on your side. Not necessarily in a fight that would make a lot of sense in some ways, because like maybe a Space Marine player who's on the side of Restoration might team up with an Orc player who's on the side of Restoration. You two have to figure out how that's going to work from a fluff narrative side. I have faith that our players can do that. But that ultimately we're recognizing that folks have lives outside of Warhammer and need to get home, and we don't want to be playing from sun up to sundown. That was partially also where the reduction came in, into making the games a little bit more manageable from a time perspective, not wanting to have 4-hour slogs as we played 3,000 points aside, which can be huge games for 8th Ed.
Yeah, definitely. And that kind of leads into this other point that I wanted to play with, was that the mindset going into making a list for this type of event is going to be very different than the mindset where you're going to, like, Renegade Open or Midwest Conquest, which are both fantastic events, but the mission of those events is different. And so my question to you is, do you think that these are fundamentally different communities, or do you think that there's a lot of overlap between the friendly narrative based crowd and the competitive crowd? Are they all the same people showing up to the events, or do you have 90% of people being in one type or the other?
That's a really good question, Mike. And I've thought about this one a lot, actually, since we came up with the event. I don't think they're 2 separate communities. I think there is potential for a lot of crossover. I think more so than anything else, the difference is the mindset. I know a lot of competitive players that can go into a space and go, you know what, I'm going to take this unit that's kind of garbage, and I'm going to take this unit, I'm going to make it really weird, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And if crap happens during the game that, like, things don't go well for me, whatever. I'm just here to roll some dice and have fun. Even though, like, I like to win, or I like to go to these other events and maybe then, like, dial it up and say, like, okay, well, the mission of this event's a little bit more streamlined, more efficient, more trying to get individual victory or accolades. So I'm gonna be able to do that. I'm gonna be able to switch back into that kind of mindset. It's more for us, thinking about it from the standpoint of if weird stuff happens, how are you going to take that? How are you going to engage with that? Because I'm gonna say, like, in this event, in the Chronicles, weird stuff's gonna happen. The terrain isn't set in a way that's necessarily, like, typically streamlined or where, like, table to table, you're going to have a general setup. Everything is going to be different. There's going to be different rules coming at you. Some things are going to be really, really beneficial for some armies. Some things are not. And it's going to be very dependent upon the table/scenario that you end up with, and how you react to that is going to be, I think, the key part. Because I also, like, I know folks either from either side, or either folks who tend to be more competitive or folks who tend to be less so. I know folks who can't do that switch well. And like, whether you're more maybe on the competitive side and you don't love it when things are a little bit less consistent, or a little bit less, like, typical, or you're maybe on, more the narrative friendly roll some dice side, and if folks go the other way, you're not as comfortable with that. That's fine. I would say that this event is one where you have to be flexible. You have to be willing to engage with it as a story. Even if that's a pretty significant advantage to you, you have to be willing to try that out and have fun with it just from that standpoint. I know that, this event, even just looking at the roster of players, there's folks who, if you did break it down to sides, would fall on both. But I have faith that everyone that's signed up for it, everyone that's going to play, is going to be able to make those switches. It's going to be able to make have that attitude of flexibility. And that's really what we're about. As long as you have that attitude, I think there's a ton of crossover. There's a ton of things in this event that work for all players. If you don't have that flexibility, this might be a tough one for you. I'm just gonna level with folks. If you don't have that, this is gonna be a tricky event.
Yeah, I think one of the things that when I first started thinking about the event, I was thinking about how to make a list that was competitive in some way. A competitive list that also had a really strong narrative component to it. And in talking with you about this earlier, it seemed that maybe I put the cart before the horse a little bit in that really don't come at it with I'm going to make a competitive list and then make it be fluffy. Come up with a fluffy list and then throw in a few accoutrements here and there.
Absolutely.
And so kind of what I'm thinking about now is something that in this event Forge World is not allowed, so that takes out some of these a little bit more idiosyncratic types of units. It also takes out those beat stick units, but also takes out some kind of fluffy things that or flavorful things that I would never bring in an actual competitive list. But there are plenty of other good choices that I wouldn't take in a competitive list just within the codex.
Right.
So things like Sunshark bombers. They're interesting, fun, flexible units that in a pickup game or something like that are totally fun to play with, but not something that you see in an ITC event. And so bringing a Sunshark bomber is something that I'm thinking about. Using things like, basically trying to keep myself to a Highlander format for everything that isn't troops.
Yep.
So one data sheet one replicate of each data sheet, and using things like breachers, which I normally wouldn't use in a competitive list. So things like that, I think, are hopefully something that will make it through the review process and come out the other side in some form. But overall, it just requires a little bit different mindset that you have to kind of step back and say, oh yeah, what are the things that I want to play with, but I never get a chance to, and those are the things that maybe should make it into this type of list.
Exactly. I think that's exactly what we're going for. And I think your framing of the mentality of how you went into building your list is exactly right. Of thinking about it, not from I'm going to build an efficient list and then kind of throw in some concessions as my starting point, but as I'm going to build, let's put together some fun units, some goofy stuff, and then maybe I'll throw in one or two, throw in a couple more competitive, like more streamlined or more efficient choices as kind of like an in-between piece. I think starting from that latter mindset is going to allow you to be a lot more successful as you're building a list for this. And that's ultimately, I think, what we had in mind. Because, and I will say, like, I think folks can sometimes have confused a little bit the event, the list, in thinking like, if I turn in a narrative list, I'm good. But what we think about in regards to that is that ultimately anything can more or less be narrative, right? Like you could say, as an Eldar player, I'm going to bring 50 Dark Reapers under the old rules, and like that's my narrative. It's a craft world of Dark Reapers. Like, well, okay, like that's cool. I mean, I'm glad you have narrative behind that, and you've maybe thought through. You've written a story. Awesome, we love that. But that doesn't necessarily solve. It doesn't necessarily make for great games for a lot of folks who might bring more balanced lists, and it ultimately doesn't meet that friendly criteria. And so thinking about it from, I like to even to some extent not take the narrative out of the list building as I think about these lists for Chronicles. more so thinking about it again from that standpoint of what are some of the fun units that I want to play with, and then how can I build a narrative around that? How can I create some story out of that? Like I look to the Eldar list that was given as an example in the packet itself. That's actually the list that I'm going to be taking for the 1500 point. Because we have so many guys running it, we actually are going to be switching off, and we can't win anything obviously, but we're just there to have some fun, roll some dice, and give people good games. That Eldar list is probably the thing I'm going to take. And when I look at that list, with Asherman, it's got 3 units of Dire Avengers, and then mostly Highlander from there. It's got, I think, 2 Wraith Lords in it that don't even have guns. They're just sitting there with Wraith Blades to like sit next to Asherman as he runs up, like just towering out over him. When I think about that, though, like using stratagems effectively, that list could actually be, to me, one of the stronger lists that I would like to see. With the deep striking of infantry units, I could have a fire dragon unit right next to your vehicle and blow it up right away. And that's whatever. It has a lot of the invuln saves from Asherman kind of working together. Most of them are not super great because it's a lot of close combat units that are going to be spread the field, but there are elements there that even if played right could be tricky. It's still a relatively balanced list in that it does things in pretty much every phase. Doesn't have much for transport, so it's pretty slow. But like when I think about it, that's maybe kind of close to the top end of the list that I would like to see in terms of efficiency, in terms of streamlining. Because I really want to encourage folks to really take some weird stuff. I got a list yesterday that I absolutely adore. And it's a World Eaters Demon list. I guess kind of like the Demonkin of old, where it's pretty much, everything is in numbers of 8 or multiples of 8 because that's Khorne's number. It's like multiple cultist units, a unit of possessed, I think some spawn. It's got a couple characters, including a Dark Apostle. On the demon side, it's got a 24 pack of bloodletters, but 5 fleshhounds, a couple characters, pretty much all foot slogs. And when I think about it, like that's a really interesting list. Like how often do you see, a World Leaders list without maybe berserkers that can get up in your face, attack twice in the combat phase, and annihilate you, right? Like he's relying on possessed as his like big heavy hitter unit. He's relying on cultists, like not even like cultists that have been efficient or are creating the best amount of bodies, just like cultists that have leadership from the Dark Apostle, right? Like that's his bit. Thinking about lists like that, like what's the stuff that you don't see, and then being able to kind of go from there.
Yeah. So, I did it again where I had a point and now I've yeah. So one of the challenges with making this type of event, I would assume, is how to be consistent in setting the bar for what is a friendly list versus a unfriendly list, and that's something that I think a lot of people coming into an event, if they're not accustomed to it, are going to be particularly concerned about. So can you talk a little bit about at least your guys' approach to how to maintain a consistent set of criteria for what is and what isn't a good list?
So this is an answer that might even scare you and some of your viewers in that there aren't necessarily a lot of structures in place to keep it consistent. And that's part of the bit. Like that's for us, that actually part of the bit of the mentality that we want our players to go in with, that it might not be super consistent. Like we try to really weed out all like the the nastier stuff or the really efficient streamlined stuff. I should say I do a pretty good job of that. As somebody who's run the friendly for a couple of years, and I more or less eyeball that. I've got a couple different like little things that I kind of look out for in terms of number of weighted shots, efficiency of how fast you get into combat with close combat units, stuff like that. But ultimately, there's a little bit of eyeballing to it. Like that's the reality. I will say in terms of consistency, I do the vast majority of all of the list stuff. I've been doing that for a couple of years. I've got a pretty good read for it. And I keep up to date with most 40K stuff in terms of forums. It usually takes me about a month to like know a book, like a new book that comes out. I think when you turned in your stuff for Tau, it was like a month in-ish, and I had to look up some stuff. I'm not gonna lie, like some of the changes that had happened, I wasn't 100% on. But I'm usually pretty quick to get that. You know, in helping to create some consistency rather than dividing up lists among a couple different folks and trying to do that. It's more or less on me, and I've got Ryan to kind of like be a check, like all right, here's what I'm thinking. Take a look at this and see if this is a read that you agree with. And so, you know, in me doing it myself, there is a degree of consistency there. But again, that's part of the bit, is that there is an eyeballing aspect to it. There isn't like a criteria for comp or anything like that we use. You know, there is partially an X factor of, you know, the parts coming together and how does that create a list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, I think you doing all the preliminary, or you doing the bulk of the checking certainly makes or enforces some structure and some uniformity within a faction, right? So like if I submit a list and another guy submits a Tau list, you know, you're going to be looking for the same thing in both lists. I think potentially the part where it becomes less consistent is when you're going between factions, because that's going to be influenced by your personal perception of what's friendly and what's not friendly within each faction. And so in that scenario, having multiple people look at lists would potentially result in a little bit more consistency. But, you know, again, like you said, if we're going into this event with that expectation of, you know, this isn't going to be, you know, the optimized list. And so does it, you know, in some cases, I kind of wonder, you know, does it really matter, right? Like you can make an argument that, you know, if we're not being optimized anyway, does it really make a difference if you're here or here, or, you know,
right?
Like it's not going to work out to be, you know, not everyone's going to be up here. And even when we are talking about a unrestricted, you know, no comp environment, you know, there's still arguments to be made about imbalances between factions based on point values and stuff like that. So, you know, yes, you're adding another level of abstraction to that, but, you know, that's kind of, like you said, that's part of the bit, right?
Right. And I will say, you know, looking at the roster of folks, there's a large chunk of the folks that are coming to the event that are, that I don't think give two poops about, you know, how optimized their list is or efficiency or anything like that. Like they're just bringing the stuff that they love and they're going to roll dice with it. And I would say if you are worried about, if you're worried about like the power level creep between the lists, or you're worried a little bit about optimization, just as a player, you're probably stronger than a large chunk of the field. And so like, even if you end up with a list that maybe is a little bit on the like lower end of your matchup, you're probably going to be fine. You're going to be in the game. And that's partly what we're going for as we do a lot of this checking. Again, you know, as you said, as I said, as you repeated as well, like that's part of the bit. And, you know, that's part of the flexibility. That's part of that mindset that we want our players to come in with, that, you know, things aren't always going to be super balanced in these games. They're not always going to be, you know, super right, whether that's a matchup issue or a table rule that maybe is really tricky for your army to deal with. You know, part of the feedback that I've given some folks who've gone like really hard with either close combat or really hard with shooting is that you might show up at a scenario or a table that like has a rule that's going to really mess up your day. Or like, if you can't be a little mobile and like get two objectives, ooh, like this could be a real, like you could have a rough scenario or two, which to me is part of the bit. It's part of like my army showed up. Oh, we're maybe not equipped for this. How am I as a commander going to like figure this out? We're going to have to take that hill regardless, even if we're Tau and we don't have close combat, like we have to go to the middle. We're going to have to do it, guys. Let's go. You know, that's part of the fun for me, at least, as I set this up.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what I'm hearing you say is, you know, you're coming to this event to have fun, so just relax and have fun.
Yeah.
Don't worry too much about it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good philosophy to have for any event, right? Like, you know, if you're a person going to LVO, you're probably not going to win. So you should go to have fun.
Sure. Yeah.
If you're going to, you know, a smaller event, yeah, your chances might be better, but you're still, the chances of you winning are still lower than your chances of not winning, all else equal. So just go to an event to have fun. And I think that's especially the case here where, the event seems to be built around, reinforcing this idea, like, guys, it's a game, have fun.
Yep. And not to say that folks, that it's not fun to go for wins, or that it's not fun to play more streamlined or more efficient. Like, that can be really fun. And like, I myself have played competitively for years. Like, I did it in the Warhammer Fantasy circuit. I occasionally dabble into that now. That can be really, really fun. And don't want to dismiss people's view of fun for that. I think it's really important for me to also be able to recognize that those competitive events are fun for a lot of folks. Otherwise, they wouldn't be having them, right? Like, they wouldn't exist. Just for this, again, it goes back to that mindset of flexibility. It goes back to that recognition that, things are going to get weird. It's not going to be consistent. It's not going to be maybe what I'm used to. It's not going to be maybe, always fair. And that's got to be okay. That's got to, on some level, be okay with you as you walk into the doors on this event.
Yeah, and that sounds great. It reminds me a little bit of some of the old, like, I don't remember what it was called for fantasy. It was like the General's Compendium or something like that, where they gave you a outline of how to do campaign events for Warhammer Fantasy in like 5th edition or something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe earlier than that even, and that's kind of the time when I started playing. I started playing, around 99, 2000, something like that. And that was before, this massive online community existed, at least that I was aware of. And I think that's a fair statement to say, but I'm not going to pretend like I knew everything. And so when I would play in the basement with my buddies, it was about, hey, this is a unit that I think is fun. And by the way, I'm also going to look at what unit is going to bash your face in the best. And and so the kind of like meta that we developed as kids basically is that we're always trying to one up each other with the biggest, best thing. And so that's basically the bedrock on which my perspective of the hobby is built. And so, moving from that background, having this, competitive, but not competitive in the, grand sense, right? If you're competing against 3 other people, that's not the same as competing against everyone in the world and building lists to compete at that scale.
Right.
But moving from that localized, pre-internet era into this era now, I think perhaps people coming into the hobby now have a very different perspective on the game than people would have 20 years ago. And that's just a consequence of the way that the community's grown and the way the game has changed and a million other things. But I think it's an interesting challenge and a really nice contribution to the diversity of the hobby, have this type of event on the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we aim for. We're ultimately aiming to be something different, not because we don't want to be like other events, but because we want to provide a space that's just alternate to what maybe other opportunities that are out there. Because want to recognize again that different folks have fun in different ways, and want to recognize that there isn't necessarily a lot of spaces for the friendly narrative type stuff. And so really it's about creating diversity in the hobby, is ultimately what we're trying to accomplish here.
Yeah, and I think one of the greatest strengths of the hobby is that it allows people from very different backgrounds, not just speaking in a game sense, right? I was just talking about gaming in my basement before the internet and now, but people from very different walks of life to all come together and have a moment of hey, we're just playing a game. We can appreciate each other in this context at least. And the more opportunities we have that through more different events where it pulls different crowds, I think is really great. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, this event there's so much of a social aspect to it. There's so much of a connection forging thing to this. I've met some of my best friends through this hobby, and I through the competitive circuit of fantasy back in the day, have friends all over the U.S. I have folks internationally. It's led to some really cool things, and so. Again, providing additional spaces for that in the form of an event, and to be able to do that in a different way, and in a way that folks don't normally get to see, which might bring out other folks, might bring up folks that don't normally go to events, or might be afraid to go to a streamlined, efficient event. Come to this one, see what it's like, and maybe that brings some more folks into the hobby, brings some more folks into the general community.
Yeah, and I think there's certainly a growing, portion of the community that's interested in this type of event. There was a poll done by I think it was Preferred Enemies, or maybe it was the Flying Monkey guys, but they did a poll saying, would you want to do a friendly style event in addition to or side by side with a competitive event? Basically having two different tracks, and there was really strong support for having the different tracks. And so, like I said, I'm just happy to see more of this type of event. So, yeah, I guess that's all I had as far as questions, comments, and concerns for you. Is there anything else that you want to add before we wrap up?
No, I think I'm good. We'll say I'm excited to have you, Mike, at the event. We actually know each other from back at college days. So excited to see you in person again come September. And we're just really excited for all the different folks who are going to come into the event, and to really share in, I think, what is going to be a really cool style and a really cool story. We've got a lot of really fun stuff planned that we'll be previewing more and more as we get closer. This is an event that I wish that I would play the whole thing. Like I'm so excited for the really cool stuff we have.
Yeah, it sounds like it's going to be great. The event is full currently, correct?
Correct. Although there isn't much of a wait list so far. We think we've only got one person on the wait list, and as somebody who's run events in the past, there's always people who drop. Like, not that we're banking on that or hoping for that, but if you are interested, if folks are interested, get ready. Get on the registration, get on the wait list, because I think we could easily see a couple more folks on a wait list potentially get in. And for folks who get on the wait list, it's no risk. If you have to pay the money to be on the wait list as part of registration, and if you don't end up playing because you're sitting on the wait list, money's coming back to you. Like, we don't keep that. So it's a no risk thing with the potential to, again, get into a really cool event.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. And I will put a link to the event in the description. So people watching this, check it out. All right, so great. I guess that's it then. Thank you, Mike, for joining with us, or joining me. Like you said, there'll be a link in the description below if you want to check anything out about Chronicles. Other than that, thanks for watching, and of course, happy wargaming.